This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
The BFM Breakfast Grill, connecting you to the top people and ideas. Presented by U Mobile.
You're listening to The Breakfast Grill. I'm Lyn Mak. A year ago, Malaysia was rocked by a surprise change of government. The Pakatan Harapan administration collapsed and was replaced by the Perikatan Nasional Coalition. And since then, the landscape of politics has certainly become almost unrecognizable. So to help us make sense of it, as well as to understand what comes next, we're speaking this morning with Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, and Ibrahim Suffian, Program Director at the Merdeka Center. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having us.
So it is the anniversary of Langkah Sheraton. And since then, a lot has happened. We've had a global pandemic, we've had an oil price war, and of course, a state of emergency, which is still ongoing. But if all goes to plan, we should still be able to have GE15 in just over 2 years' time. So with that in mind, what would you say were the main implications from Langkah Sheraton that we may carry forward into the next couple of years? Ben, perhaps let's start with you.
I think Langkah Sheraton, is going to go down in Malaysian political history as a point in time when, the polarities of power flipped back from what appeared to be a democratic breakthrough to resurgence of the established political elites. So in my view, it closed an episode where there was an opportunity for perhaps more liberal politics and reform-oriented politics to take root, and instead went back to the established politics along ethnic and racial lines that we are so used to in Malaysia.
Do you think those opportunities are totally lost then, or is it just optimistic that we had them to begin with, considering Malaysia's track record?
I think the opportunity is not lost because the political situation is very fluid. And I think for the political players who are vying for power, they do understand that they can't win it all. They can't take it all. They need partners, and they need coalition partners. And I think the other part is the realization that they need to have to move forward. They need some reforms to improve the system and to continue to grow the economy, because I think all of it, is underpinned by how well the government performs. So the idea that you have a Malay majority government, only works if it delivers to the Malay majority electorate. If it doesn't, then I think other models are then up for discussion.
And James, what are your thoughts here? Looking back at Langkah Sheraton and what we've had in between, how do you think this is going to continue to affect us here in Malaysia?
So I think I agree mostly what Ben has said about the regression of democratic space in Malaysia. What I see is basically 2 years of lost opportunities, and that in fact, Pakatan Harapan was actually never really given a chance to show that it's capable of ruling. I think the bigger issue is really that, that now we have a Malay majority government, and suddenly it's not working the way it's supposed to work. In other words, the underlying assumption is that, you have a Malay majority government, all the Malay parties will come together, but in fact, that has not happened. What has happened is that the parties inside the government are actually fighting among themselves to see who is the dominant party. So it's really quite interesting now that power is basically in the hands of the Malays. They can't agree among themselves who is the dominant one. The analogy I've been using is basically that under the old Barisan Nasional government, the logic was basically you had one core Malay parties, you have multiple parties representing all the other groups. So now you have 3 core Malay parties, you don't have one dominant party. So basically, that's the reason why you see lots of tensions between UMNO and Bersatu. 2 tigers basically can't share the same mountain. But it's really interesting because for years, people like myself and Ben and other people have been saying that, you really can't run a government basically representing one group. And basically, I think that's turned out to be true.
Specifically, what do you think we can expect out of these very tangled political machinations that we're seeing right now? Yes, conflict between the Malay majority parties, but going forward, will we start to see kind of an M&A sort of situation where one party cannibalizes the other. Will we start to see Bersatu losing its hold on power going forward, effectively losing the mountain, so to speak?
I think what has happened is that since all this conflict has come to the fore, basically I think between UMNO and Bersatu, they're looking for a new political model that will keep either party in power and to move forward. Basically, I think the conclusion among the establishment figures is that the most stable model we had is still the Barisan Nasional model. That you have one core Malay party and you can have multiple parties representing all the other minority groups in Malaysia. That's the reason why you look at Merdeka Nasional. Recently, they managed to convince Gerakan to join. So now there are 5 parties in Merdeka Nasional. But I think the other big lesson I think they've learned in the last 12 months is basically that Malaysia today is not the Malaysia of 1970 or the 1980s. In terms of political groups, interest groups, it's much more diffuse. And that to bring everybody together, you really cannot have sort of an authoritarian mode of government moving forward.
I think the political arena, on the Malay part of the spectrum is very crowded because in 2018, we saw the Malay vote largely split 3 ways. But now we do have more players within the Malay political spectrum. We have, Bersatu there, which is a splinter of UMNO, but we also have Pejuang and Muda, which is a splinter of a splinter of a splinter, So you have quite a lot of players there vying for the same electorate. And the electorate hasn't really expanded. We're not sure when the government will let the 18-year-olds and above vote. So assuming that if we have elections relatively soon, and that election involves mostly those that are already registered to vote right now, we are looking at, I think, a very challenged electoral situation where, the 2 main dominant parties in the Malay arena, PAS and UMNO, probably will continue to take the lion's share, and Bersatu will be able to hang on to power or to political situation if they can partner with at least one of those 2 parties. So I think I can't rule out, Bersatu being cast into oblivion right now, but they do have a chance if they are in partnership, let's say with PAS, because PAS does have strength, and I think PAS has benefited from the split up within the political arena in 2018 and continues to do so. And I think they have managed their political situation quite deftly. And so now they are controlling 3 state governments. They are in other state governments as EXCO members, and likewise now have positions in the cabinet that they are taking advantage of. So by itself, I think Bersatu, yes, as a newer party, as a party that has fairly shallow grassroots, will be in a, I think, challenging situation. But if they continue to partner with other coalition partners, other parties, and I think they have a chance of surviving this current election cycle. But for the country itself, speaking broadly, I think, we are in a kind of uncertain space right now, uncharted waters. And largely it's because the political situation has not been clarified. There's no certainty in terms of leadership, in terms of who's going to govern. And we've had that scenario, immediately from 2018, because immediately after Pakatan Harapan formed the government, the question revolved around the succession from Dr. Mahathir to Anwar Ibrahim. And so a lot of people were holding back decisions, policy decisions, business and investment decisions to await the change of leadership because they wanted stability. And that has not happened. And likewise now under the Perikatan Nasional arrangement, that certainty isn't there as well. So I think if we head into early elections, and with the situation remaining uncertain in terms of who will govern the country with a clear outright majority, we will continue to go sideways, and we might lose another 3 to 5 years, and it might be a lost decade for the country.
I've been speaking with Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, and Ibrahim Suffian, Program Director at the Merdeka Center. Up next, a closer look at the leadership landscape here in Malaysian politics, so stay tuned. BFM 89.9.
You are listening to the BFM Breakfast Grill, brought to you by U Mobile.
On the Breakfast Grill this morning is Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, and Ibrahim Suffian, Program Director at the Merdeka Center. So Ben, there are a lot of questions as well surrounding Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin and whether or not he will be able to remain in power, considering the headwinds facing Bersatu and considering how he came to power in the first place, which didn't necessarily win him a lot of popularity votes. Will he be a one-term prime minister? And, as things stand at this point, who else stands a chance at the prime minister post?
Right now, it's a very polarized situation. Some parts of Malaysians don't feel that Muhyiddin Yassin is their prime minister. But a vast majority of the majority Malay Muslim electorate continue to see him as their favorite candidate to remain as prime minister. In fact, through the polls that we have done in the past, you can see, a very dichotomous point of view from across the Malaysian electorate that vast majorities, upwards of 80% of Malay Muslims favored Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin as PM, and then only the other candidates. So he does have an outside support from within the Malay electorate, and partly because none of the other prime ministerial candidates right now are very strong. Whether it is Zahid Hamidi from UMNO, whether it's Anwar Ibrahim from PH, or even Dr. Mahathir himself, leading his own group. So none of them, factor very strongly there. But I suppose, whether someone becomes prime minister or not, it's not just a popularity contest, but whether their party will perform well in an election. And I think this is where I think the uncertainty comes in, because I think Bersatu, in partnership with PAS, certainly can command a number of seats, but it's doubtful that they can gain an outright majority. So they will need to seek coalition partners from across the aisle or within the current grouping that they have now, whether the Sarawakians, the Sabahans, or even UMNO is willing to continue to work with him after the next general election. I think it's an open question. So I won't rule him out, largely because he is, I would say, the best or compromise candidate that the political arena has to offer for the Malay majority public, and the other contestants are all leading parties that no one really commands majority right now. So I want to say that he does have some kind of incumbency advantage that if he is adroit in doing this, probably could steer himself to leadership.
So, James, do you think that Tan Sri Muhyiddin has that incumbency advantage, as Ben put it? And will that be enough to carry him into the Prime Minister position once again, if we do head into GE15 in about 2.5 years' time?
I think it's very difficult to try to predict whether Muhyiddin will even lead Bersatu into the next GE15, because we know that there's quite a strong faction with UMNO itself who's trying to force an early general election. I think the key to whether he'll survive basically hinges on two things. One is whether he can build the Bersatu's strength, say, within the next 12 months. And secondly, whether he can attract new support into Perikatan Nasional. Because right now, these tensions between UMNO and Bersatu is real. As I mentioned earlier, there is really quite a strong group in UMNO which is trying to pull the trigger and force a general election. Now, I suspect if they were to force a general election right now, I suspect the vote or the voting pattern will be fairly similar to what we saw in 2018. I think the key to a big change will be whether the under 18 will get the vote. If that group comes in before the next general election, I think it will be a game changer. And I think the leadership knows this, and that's the reason why they do not really want to allow the under 18 to come in. But coming back to Muhyiddin's position, I think the other thing that has not been spoken in public is the status of his health. We may think that he'll be around in 2 years' time, but the fact is that he may not actually want to lead the government in 2 years' time due to, we haven't really been given status update on his health, so we really don't know. But we do know that there's a lot of tensions in Perikatan Nasional. There are lots of tension even within Bersatu itself. The other thing to note is that because of the instability in this government, we should not assume that the current government will stay in power until the next general election. If UMNO really pulls the trigger, then Bersatu may actually cross the aisle and create a new coalition just to avoid a general election.
So, James, then what is your gauge of the strength of that faction of UMNO that is pushing for an early general election? And what's the probability that we will see a GE within the next year, perhaps, as opposed to in 2.5 years?
We don't know what is the strength because UMNO was supposed to hold their General Assembly end of January, so that was postponed because of the emergency. Because at the General Assembly, you will get a gauge of what is the mood of UMNO through the, the mood of the delegates. So because there was no meeting, we're not sure. But what we do know is that a significant number of senior UMNO leaders, especially for the Najib administration, that group really wants to pull the trigger. We also know there is a small group of people in UMNO right now who are very sympathetic to this coalition with Bersatu. So UMNO is basically quite split. And we also know that within UMNO itself, there was also a group who thinking of creating, interestingly enough, national unity government. They think that, because of the COVID crisis, the economic crisis, everything, the best hope for Malaysia to move forward is actually some sort of a national unity government. So I think everything is up in the air. But again, everything comes back to what Muhyiddin would do after the emergency is lifted on the 1st of August. There was even talk that, he may not want to lift it on the 1st of August. So, because I think the COVID thing, when you look at it carefully, COVID is just one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that Malaysian economy is really in big trouble. If you look at just the officially reported figures, the economy is basically contracted by about 10%. But if you were to speak to people in industries, right, they will say that it's actually much more serious than that. So coming out of the emergency on 1st of August, right, it may not be all good news for him. Because I think the mistake made by the government was basically the last budget. They should have spent a lot more to restart the economy, but they were being conservative. They didn't want to spend that kind of money. So now, they're sort of caught up in the mess that they created themselves.
So, gentlemen, we've been talking mostly about the government so far in this conversation. I also want to shift our attention a little bit to the state of the opposition and particularly opposition leadership at this point in time, because Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim has made several claims to the effect that he has I believe his words were, a strong, convincing, formidable majority. And yet that majority has failed to really materialize in any way that we can report. And there have been reports then subsequently that he has been losing support of his own coalition members within Pakatan Harapan. So what can we expect out of our opposition coalitions going forward? Do they have the strength to take on a general election in 2 years' time, not even in 1 year?
Well, I think the opposition is consolidated in the sense that number one, I hate doing this, but, when we look at political support, typically it goes down to culture or also ethnic groups. From the data that we have and also just speaking to people around, you can sort of understand that the non-Malay support for parties of Pakatan Harapan is still relatively strong. So even if there are some unhappiness towards, some of these parties and their leaders, I think most of the non-Malay voters continue to support Pakatan Harapan should an election go by, whether it is going to be this year or in a couple of years' time. At the same time, I think Pakatan Malay support from amongst the Malay electorate has also reached perhaps its lowest point. So how they perform, I think, will be dependent on the kind of configuration we see heading into an election. If, let's say, the election is going to be Pakatan Harapan against a consolidated, cooperative Perikatan Nasional where PAS, PPBM and UMNO are working together, placing one candidate in a district, then I think Pakatan Harapan is going to have an uphill challenge, particularly in the Malay majority seats. But if the situation unfolds where it becomes almost a free-for-all, where UMNO decides to go alone, and Perikatan is left with PAS and PPBM, and Pakatan Harapan remains within the same coalition context, then I think Pakatan Harapan still has a decent chance in snagging quite a large number of seats in Peninsular Malaysia. And then they will then have to seek partners or allies in Sabah and Sarawak to potentially form government. I think all three peninsula-based coalitions will have to look at that to try and win over. The advantage that Pakatan Harapan has, despite I think what people say about the leadership issues, about its direction and about its structural integrity, the challenge, or rather the advantage it has is that its support base within one segment of the Malaysian electorate, particularly the middle class and urban, is fairly solid. That's not been changing very much. It does rely on a smaller group of Malay voters. But if these Malay voters become more and more disgruntled, disenfranchised by either UMNO or Perikatan Nasional, then Pakatan Harapan will be able to take advantage from that. From just a very simple calculation, Pakatan Harapan pretty much just needs about 22% of the Malay electorate in order for them to get the lion's share of seats in West Malaysia. In 2018, they only obtained about 22.4. So they don't really need a lot. And I think right now, they are probably doing less than 22%, but not very far below that. And I think the challenge lies with, parties like Barisan Nasional or Perikatan Nasional, because they are just working largely within the Malay context. So if they gain something, the other guys will lose something, but they still cannot make the gains with the non-Malay electorate. And even though a lot of Malaysian voters like to think it's a Malay Muslim countries, non-Muslim voters, make up a sizable share of the electorate at, about 40%. It's a huge chunk. And it also means that they need to get partners from Sabah and Sarawak to cross the line.
I think Ben's analysis is essentially correct. So I start off with the premise that if the election will be held soon, because of the similar voting pattern with 2018, Pakatan will start off with about 50 seats. So you're working on the assumption that they'll grab about 40 for the DAP, fairly stable, and at least 10 for what they call PKR. So we're starting with about 50 seats. So that's about 25% of seats in parliament already. So they only need basically Sabah or Sarawak to bring them up to, starting point, which is about 80 or 90. And from there on, they can look at defections and new coalition partners in order to form a government. I think one of the key things that came out very clearly from the Sheraton move is that certainly Sabah and Sarawak became much more important. And because of that, I think everyone is looking towards the Sarawak side, because Sarawak is interesting in the sense that, Sarawak is sort of neither here, neither there. All the peninsula parties that we're used to are actually not found in Sarawak at all. And secondly, Sarawak is heading towards a Sarawak state election very soon. And it appears, at least for the current moment, that GPS is very strong. So whatever game is being played at the federal level, I think GPS in some ways will be the kingmaker. But also, if you're going to hold a general election say in the next 12 months, right? So GPS block will be about 20 seats. So that seat will really be crucial to sort of icing on the cream. Whichever side on the peninsula side, you can put a coalition together.
I've been speaking with Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, and Ibrahim Suffian, Program Director at the Merdeka Center. We're heading into the 8:30 news bulletin now, but stay tuned for this special extended edition of The Breakfast Grill, BFM 89.9.
You are listening to the BFM Breakfast Grill, brought to you by U Mobile.
On this special extended edition of The Breakfast Grill this morning is Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, and Ibrahim Suffian, Program Director at the Merdeka Center. So not too long ago, we were talking about potentially having a prime ministerial candidate from East Malaysia in the form of Datuk Sri Shafie Apdal. What do you think is the likelihood of us actually being able to have a prime minister from East Malaysia in the near future?
My position is that the Malay establishment in Peninsular Malaysia, Malaya, is not ready to give a chance to somebody from East Malaysia to be the prime minister. But I think there is sort of not a consensus, but increasing consensus that perhaps one of the DPM posts should be offered to somebody from East Malaysia. But I don't think the Malay establishment is ready for a prime minister, even a Malay prime minister or Muslim prime minister from East Malaysia.
Ben, what about you? What do you think?
I think I echo what James is saying, because we've tested some of these things in the small polls that we've done before, and we do know that not a lot of the West Malaysian electorate is aware of Datuk Sri Shafi Abdal and see him as a national leader for now. But I want to be able to say that I think in politics there can still be surprises, and I think the surprises can come sometime in the future, even the near future, when the size of the electorate is expanded to include young people, and when the political situation, I think, moves on from beyond the current stable of leaders. Because right now we have leaders who have essentially been in politics since, my God, the 70s. So I think in due time, I think the political arena will open up. And I think the pathway towards prime ministership for someone from East Malaysia probably will be like what James said, becoming a deputy prime minister, and then subsequently in the following term or so, that individual could perhaps contest for the prime minister's position. But in order to do so, the party has to be able to obtain a large number of seats. And so I think this is a role for the East Malaysian parties to also play, where if they can collaborate with one another and establish, a kind of East Malaysian bloc, then they will have an outsized voice in Malaysian politics. So they don't just have to advocate for their respective states, Sabah or Sarawak, but they can create another force in Malaysian politics that forces political parties or coalitions from West Malaysia to deal with them, because together, Sabah and Sarawak has something like 60 seats, and so if they collaborate with one another, they can be quite potent in charting the direction of the country and taking some of the power for themselves.
All right, and for a last question to you both, gentlemen, it's kind of a twofold question. What are some of the key issues that you see as being vital heading into GE15? And at the end of the day, who do you think will win?
Let me just take a stab at that. I think number one, the economy will always be an important issue, and it has, I think, been exacerbated by the pandemic. The pandemic has deepened and potentially lengthened the time we need to get out from the economic difficulties that the country is facing right now. And when we speak specifically about the economy, the key component there that's going to be affected are largely younger voters, people who are entering the workforce, because they are bearing the brunt of the slowdown. So basically, younger people are last in, first out kind of situation. And secondly, women. Women in the workforce have been, I think, affected more than men. I think partly because they have to carry out their household duties, their family duties, but at the same time still have to work for a living. And I think the pandemic has exposed certain weaknesses in the system, particularly with respect to childcare, support, and also the educational services. So a lot of that area, I think, are issues where people are going to be looking at for answers from the politicians. And so those politicians that are parties that can address these issues, I think, will have more, credence with voters. Secondly, I think it's also it goes back to the cultural or the communal political rhetoric. To what extent has the current Malay majority outfit been able to address some of these issues? Can parties in the opposition supplant the fundamental issues of race and religion with more policy, more livelihood-oriented topics like the economic matter that I've talked about earlier? I think those are the two issues that I think people are going to look at.
I think Ben is absolutely right. I think you really can't run away from the economy. I think the other two key issues, of course, will be the performance of the government during the pandemic. I think people will be looking at that. And I think the emergency itself will become a key issue because a lot of people are very unhappy with this proclamation of emergency. I think another key issue that the opposition will bring up is the issue of backdoor government. I think they will certainly talk about whether this government is legitimate or not. I think the other big issue that will come out will be whether the under 18 will be given the chance to vote. I think this is a very, very big issue among the youth groups. If you've been looking at some of the social media chatter, I think a lot of people are really angry about this. So I think this will be some of the key issues. But of course, I also think that it's too early to try to second guess what are the key issues that will come out in 2 years' time. I'm assuming that on the government side, they will try to delay general election or GE15 as long as possible. But if they go in, say after August this year, if they were to go in later this year for GE, my prediction is that the voting pattern will be fairly similar to what we saw in 2018. I think the ground hasn't changed that much. Part of it is because of the pandemic.
So, but would your bet go for Pakatan Harapan then, James?
My bet would be that the next government, if we have an early GE15, the next government will be formed on the basis of elite bargaining rather than how the people voted.
And Ben, what about you?
I think it's hard to say which particular party or coalition is going to come on top. I think Pakatan Harapan, like I said earlier, they have a defined group of support which will give them a significant number of seats. But a lot depends. I think a lot is hanging in the air as to whether Perikatan Nasional can keep it together as a coalition of the three main parties, UMNO, PAS and PPBM. If that coalition falls apart and UMNO and PAS, or rather UMNO decides to go on its own way, then I think we're looking at potentially a very split outcome, similar to 2018, where the party with the largest or second largest number of seats can then try to reach out to the Sabahans and the Sarawakians to form a coalition government.
Well, thank you very much to the both of you, gentlemen, for joining me today. It's been a pleasure having you both on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, and Ibrahim Suffian, Program Director at the Merdeka Center. This has been The Breakfast Grill. I'm Lyn Mak, BFM 89.9.
The Breakfast Grill is brought to you by U Mobile, unleashing unlimited potential every day.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.